So good evening and welcome to everyone who is here in James Chapel at Union Theological Seminary. Also welcome to those of you who are tuning in to the live stream this evening. Welcome as well. I'm Serene Jones and I'm the president here at Union. I'm also the Johnson Family Chair in Religion and Democracy. And this is a very special evening for many reasons. But for Union as an institution, this evening is actually the kickoff or the launch of an exciting new multi-year initiative that we are starting that investigates modern conceptions of theology and spirituality. And we're calling this multi-year program the Insight Project. Now, in one way, that we hope that's what we do all the time at Union, but this program gives us a chance to bring in the biggest and most amazing, mind-changing and challenging thinkers to engage with us in theological reflection. So through a diverse array of thought-provoking lectures, screenings, performances, and on-stage conversations, over the next 5 years, Insight will provide what we hope are immersive experiences that encourage personal discoveries. At the same time, they spark new ways of seeing the world. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Union, it's long been a place where cutting-edge ideas are forged and even social movements are built. And Insight, we hope, will serve as a brilliant spotlight on this true spirit of Union, offering us a chance to extend the conversations that we have in our classrooms to a broader public, going beyond the classroom walls and exploring these new ideas through public discussion. Now, this project, the Insight Project, has been made possible for us thanks to a generous gift from an anonymous Union alumna who came to us with the desire to deepen discourse around the big questions and to provide a space, particularly for students of all sorts, to engage in dynamic interdisciplinary conversations across curricular boundaries. Isn't that wonderful to have someone who comes to you and wants you to do something like this? It's amazing. It's an incredible gift. And especially given our current political and social situation, having a gift that focuses on insight and the convergence of new thinking and the character of our social life and expanding imagination, it's desperately needed. Leading our conversation tonight is going to be my colleague, and he's also the Insight Project Director, Dr. John Thatamanil. He is at Union here, an associate professor of theology and world religions, and he is committed to the work of what we call here comparative theology. That's theology that learns from a variety of traditions. Professor Thatamanil is the past president of the North American Paul Tillich Society and the founding chair of the American Academy of Religion's Theological Education Committee. He is a frequent lecturer in churches and colleges and universities, both nationally and internationally. He co-edits with Dr. Loyal Ashton a book series with Fordham entitled Comparative Theology, Thinking Across Traditions. And just this afternoon, he sent off his final edits on his new book, which we will celebrate this evening, called Circling the Elephant. Great title. The subtitle is Constructive Theology and Interreligious Learning. Did I get that right? Yes, so we're going to work on the subtitle a little bit, make it a little better there. I hope that all of you who are gathered here will feel free to use your own social media as you're listening. Those who are online, join us on Twitter and Facebook. Use the hashtag Insight Project, and also share with your followers that tonight's conversation is going to be both live streamed, and the entire event will be soon posted on the Union YouTube channel. So without further delay, please welcome Dr. John Thatamanil.
Thank you, Serene, and welcome to all. I want to say just a word about the Insight project that we are launching today, and then offer introductions of Amitav Ghosh and Akeel Bilgrami. Christian theology has a long, complex, and ambivalent trajectory with respect to how it has imagined its place and role with respect to non-theological modes of inquiry. In the Christian West, during certain seasons, theology thought itself the queen of the sciences, with philosophy serving in the role as handmaiden. Few would imagine theology, Christian or otherwise, to play so sovereign a role now. And most progressive theologians are not given to nostalgic longing for a return to moments in which theology had such a lordly cognitive position and social prestige. There were costs entailed with such positions. In any case, lordly pretensions ill-fit a tradition that seeks to follow one who said the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. So what posture best befits theology in a moment such as ours? Might theology find a robust middle way between postures of sovereignty and self-abnegation? What in particular is theology to do in the midst of the still ongoing, if somewhat diminished, battle royale between religious fundamentalists on the one side and scientistic fundamentalists on the other, between the know-nothings and those whom Terry Eagleton has taken to calling ditchkins? Might there be more productive conversations to be had between religious thinkers and the sciences, natural and human? What can theologians learn from other companions in the humanities and the arts who are themselves participants in these richer conversations? These are among the questions that Union Theological Seminary's Insight Project seeks to answer. As already mentioned, through lectures, conversations, performances, conferences, and publications, Insight seeks to contribute to cultivating a genuinely credible contemporary theology, a theology that inhabits a posture of receptivity and mutuality with a wide array of conversation partners. We will most assuredly seek to learn, but we will also find ways to speak once again about larger visions, visions of enchantment and hallowing, visions of reverence for life and for creation. This year's theme is theology in the natural world. For future years, we are exploring themes such as theopoetics, rethinking the human, theology and economics, theology and contemplative practice. We invite you to join us for our conversations. And we are proud and honored to launch the Insight Project with this conversation with Amitav Ghosh and Akeel Bilgrami. I will say now a brief word about both. I will be relatively brief because both are immensely prominent public writers and thinkers who are likely to be well known to many in the audience. Amitav Ghosh was born in Calcutta and grew up in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. He studied in Delhi, Oxford, and Alexandria, and is the author of The Circle of Reason, The Shadow Lines in an Antique Land, Dancing in Cambodia, The Calcutta Chromosome, The Glass Palace, The Hungry Tide. I have to stop to breathe. The list is so long. And the first two volumes of the Ibis trilogy, The Sea of Poppies and The River of Smoke. Many of his books have been awarded a number of distinguished prizes, which I could rehearse with you at some length. He's been listed, his novel Sea of Poppies was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, for example. And his work has been translated into more than 20 languages. And he has served on the jury of the Locarno Film Festival and the Venice Film Festival. His essays have been published in The New Yorker, The New Republic, The New York Times. This could go on for quite some time. The one thing I'd want to add is that reading this book, The Great Derangement, is an exercise in humility for the theologian who, like me, takes himself to be somewhat conversant with philosophy, anthropology. But the very cutting-edge figures in all of these fields make appearances. References are made to Eduardo Cohn's book, How Forests Think. The most unexpected people I'm just discovering, he's long ago read. And so being in his presence, I'm sure, will be further a lesson in humility. So we're very honored and gratified that you are joining us. Thank you. Akeel Bilgrami is known to many of us. He is a local. He is the Sidney Morgenbesser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia. I really love the way he begins his sort of blurb on his website. It reads as follows: Akeel Bilgrami got a first degree in English literature from Bombay University, but defected to philosophy because he found the former too hard. The next sentence says he went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, so one wonders what literature he was reading. Joyce, perhaps? I don't know. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago after writing a dissertation, Meaning as Invariance. Light stuff, I'm sure. Other books include Belief and Meaning and Self-Knowledge and Resentment. I am most familiar with this book, Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment, and it is the theme of enchantment that is most resonant with Amitav Ghosh's work, and I thought that the two of them would be great conversation partners for that reason. Akeel is also a frequenter of my classes here at Union. He's now come twice to my Gandhi and King class, and he is currently writing a book on Gandhi, and the last time I was with him, he told me that the book is at 750 pages, so there's a lot he has to say about Gandhi, and that will be one of the topics that we will perhaps visit today, as Gandhi puts in an appearance in Amitav's book as well. So we're looking forward to a rich and lovely evening of conversation, but before the conversation begins, Amitav wants to say a word and show a bit of a clip about the book. Then he'll be back here again to say a few opening words about the book, and then Akeel and I will join him for a sustained conversation about the book. There will also be, you no doubt saw, copies of the book, and Amitav will make himself available for signing the books if you haven't already got it and read it all the way through. Now let's welcome Amitav Ghosh.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. It's my first time ever in this beautiful campus. I'd like to thank the seminary and especially President Serene Jones and, of course, John Thatamanil for inviting me. And it's wonderful to join Akeel in this conversation. I've known him for 20, 25 years or something, so it's great to be in this conversation with him. When this book was published in India, my Indian publisher, Penguin, they made a short video of it. And that might introduce some of the themes, though not perhaps the themes we're mainly going to focus on tonight, but I thought John felt it might be of interest, so we're going to show it. Climate events are very, very difficult to write about. Extreme events, improbable events are very difficult to write about. And I know this myself as a writer. I had an extraordinary encounter with a very, very strange weather event I didn't even recognize what it was because, we in India have very little awareness of phenomena like tornadoes. For years afterwards, I tried to write about this event in a sort of meaningful way. I tried to sort of even think of incorporating it in my books and novels, and I always found myself struggling with it.
I'm a marine ecologist. I've been working in the system quite some years now. And what I can tell you is the oceans are being hit in various ways that you cannot even imagine. Just look at the cost of our seafood production. What does it mean to produce those fish on your table? Now the major gear that's used to catch and produce a lot of our seafood is trawl fishers. Now this is a technique that is really unselective, it's destructive. You target a few species, but you pretty much catch an entire ecosystem in your net. Now this not just obviously has an impact on the ecosystem, but it also has a huge impact on livelihoods of small-scale fishing communities that depend on a lot of these fish species, and also a long-term sort of survival of that fishery itself. You have all these multiple stressors acting on a marine system, that have an impact, as I said, not just on ecosystems, but also on livelihoods. And you sort of have the overarching umbrella of climate change. Now that is like the recipe for a perfect storm.
Just this year, this incredible heat wave that we've had across northern India and across central India, it's astonishing, unprecedented.
It's been a problem modeling the monsoon. So even now, climate models don't all agree on whether the monsoon rainfall will increase or decrease. But what all models agree about is that the frequency of extremes is going to change, which means the frequency of droughts and excess rainfall years, that is going to be changed. For example, in 2015, you know that we are sitting in Maharashtra. In Marathwada region of Maharashtra, more than 1,000 farmers committed suicide. And you and I were paying more than rupees 200 per kilo of tur dal. Now these are all adverse impacts of the drought. So the question arises, are we adapting to this? And after all, unlike unexpected effects of climate change, droughts are nothing new. We've experienced droughts for centuries. So we should have been able to adapt. Are we adapting to it? Unfortunately, it appears that we are not adapting to it, and still there are very large impacts on agriculture, economy and so on.
If you consider that, Parliament just a couple of weeks ago finally held a session to talk about the drought, and only 80 MPs turned up to discuss what is the single most important thing that is happening in this country right now. It really does in a way defy belief.
The inconvenient truth in climate change is not that climate change is happening, but that climate change is about sharing the economic growth between nations and within nations.
If you look at the most recent sorts of weather-related events around India, so for example, these terrible deluges that have happened in Mumbai in these last 8 to 10 years, this terrible deluge that we saw in Chennai, last year. Those things are on our doorstep.
What does it mean for our cities? It means that we need to design our systems so well that you have much better systems of sanitation. You have no water retention that happens in your cities. You're able to design your green areas in ways in which your green spaces can absorb the extreme heat that happens. You need to design your cities so that you can hold the water when it falls.
Over the last 150 years or so, the direction that literature and literary fiction has taken has carried it away from all sorts of natural engagements. It's carried it more and more towards abstractions of various kinds. It's become, literature has become more and more sort of focused on urban areas, on the urban experience, on urbanity as such. That to me raises many, many interesting questions. How is it that literature, which in many ways has always historically dealt with the most important issues in the human condition, why is it that literature has turned away from this? In that sense, you could say that, the whole the whole trajectory of fiction is also imbricated in the same kind of derangement that carries people closer and closer to the sea, where they're so exposed to all these natural impacts.
Today, we are voiceless, we are powerless. We are not asking our leaders to step up their game because it concerns us, our present, and our children's future. It concerns the survival of humankind.
So there we are. John thought I might want to address this question of why I turned from fiction to climate change, and in fact, it's a question I'm very often asked. When I first started working on this book, The Great Derangement, my novelist and writer friends were actually completely amazed. They said to me, why do you want to write about climate change? I mean, that's something that engineers do. I mean, what does it have to do with fiction? So trying to answer the question of why I made this turn, I find myself having to say that, it was both something completely accidental and also completely overdetermined in a way. Because the accidental part of it is, of course, that, 20 years ago, I wasn't, climate change was not at the forefront of my mind. But I am from Bengal. I'm from the Indian part of Bengal, but I'm from the Bengal Delta. And, as you all know, Bengal, meaning West Bengal, and Bangladesh are the parts of the world that are most likely to be impacted by climate change. The impacts are already being felt. In this very small deltaic area, we have like 250 million people, with the sea rising very, very fast, and that's also compounded by other impacts, like because of various kinds of human extraction of oil and water and so on. The delta is also sinking. So, in fact, the sea level rise is multiplied by the sinking of the delta. It's sinking 4 times as fast as the sea level rise. So you can see these multiple impacts are occurring in this area. And, the literature and the culture of Bengal has always been very, very much engaged with this natural environment, because it is actually a very overpowering environment. It's, these huge rivers and this immense mangrove forest called the Sundarbans. And I happen to have an uncle who went to live in the Sundarbans a very long time ago, and as a child I used to visit them in the Sundarbans. So at a certain point I decided to set a book in the Sundarbans. It's a book called The Hungry Tide. And that was when I saw at first hand what was actually happening, the saltwater intrusion, the disappearance of islands, the disappearance of agricultural lands, and it was really kind of horrifying to see what is actually already happening in Bengal, across this entire area. And it's happening in so many ways. I mean, now so many people are having to leave the Sundarbans that actually many of them are trafficked. So the red light areas across India now are actually populated by women from the Sundarbans. It's a very strange thing that, Bengali has a very large number of speakers. In fact, I think it's 6 on the list on the list of the most widely spoken languages. And yet, until a few years ago, I would say even 20 years ago, it was rare for a Bengali traveling outside India to hear Bengali being spoken. Now, I hear Bengali everywhere, all the time. In Brooklyn, where I live half the time, the people who work on the houses, the restorers of all the brownstones, they're all Bangladeshi. If you go to Venice, if you go anywhere in Italy, Bengali is all around you. The city of Palermo has 5 Bangladeshi mosques and 2 Bangladeshi Hindu temples. So it's extraordinary what's happened. I mean, I don't think the world is actually keeping pace of the speed with which things are changing. A lot of these changes are happening unseen, so to speak. So, seeing all these things transpiring in front of my eyes, I felt that I had to, in some way, address these issues. And I think anyone who starts thinking about climate change or writing about climate change, once you actually get to know the literature, you really can't think about anything else. I mean, nothing seems of comparable importance. But even more than that, what is so powerful about this is that climate change is the Earth, really. It's an aspect of the agency of the Earth, reinscribing itself in our brains, really tearing apart these structures of knowledge that we've built over these last 300 years. It makes us have to sort of completely rethink the foundations of the culture that we've been in and of all its products. For example, of the forms of politics that we've created, of the forms of literature, the forms of art, the forms of philosophy, the forms of thought. So it's almost like once you engage with climate change, you're just unlearning. Climate change and the forms of our minds have become so profoundly sort of imbricated with each other. And, one of the most extraordinary experiences of writing this book was, I finished it in 2016, which is when, of course, there was the Paris Agreement, and there was also Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si'. And they both came out, within a few months of each other. And I read them both with very great care. And in the last part of the book, I actually compare them in a literary sense. And so I'm just going to read to you a little bit from that part of the book. These 2 documents, Laudato Si' and the Paris Agreement, occupy a realm that few texts can aspire to, one in which words effect changes in the world. But the documents are also texts brought into being through the crafts of writing, with meticulous attention being paid to form, vocabulary, and even typography. To read them as texts is revealing in many ways. As is only to be expected, the 2 works, one written by a former teacher of literature and the other by a multitude of diplomats and delegates, are not at all similar, even though they rely on many of the same materials. Yet they also have certain things in common. Perhaps the most important of these is that they're both founded on an acceptance of the research produced by climate science. In this sense, they together represent a historic milestone. Their publication marks a general worldwide acknowledgement that the Earth's climate is changing and that human beings are largely responsible for these changes. These documents can therefore rightly be seen as a vindication of climate science. But beyond that, the documents diverge sharply, although not in predictable ways. It might be thought, for example, that as a primarily religious document, the Pope's encyclical would be written in an elusive and ornate style. It might equally be expected that the agreement would, by contrast, be terse and workmanlike, as was the Kyoto Protocol, for instance. But in fact, the opposite is true. The encyclical is remarkable for the lucidity of its language and the simplicity of its construction. It is the agreement, rather, that is highly stylized in its wording and complex in its structure. The agreement is divided into 2 parts. The first and longer part is entitled Proposal by the President, while the second, which is the agreement itself, is described as an annex. Each part is preceded by a preamble, as is the convention for treaties, except that in this case, these sections are far longer and more elaborate than is customary. The preamble to the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, consists of only 5 terse declarative clauses. By contrast, the text of the Paris Agreement contains no less than 31 ringing declarations. 15 of these precede the first part of the document, the President's proposal. Some examples follow. Recalling Decision 1 CP by 17, also recalling articles, further recalling relevant decisions, welcoming the adoption, agreeing to uphold and promote. The lines pour down the page in a waterfall of gerunds. And then, without the sentence yet reaching an end, the clauses change into numbered articles as the document switches gear and decides to adopt and requests the Secretary General. And so the proposal continues, covering 18 densely printed pages. Yet, this large block of text, with its 140 numbered clauses and 6 sections, consists of only 2 sentences, one of which runs on for no less than 15 pages. Indeed, this part of the agreement is a work of extraordinary compositional virtuosity. Thousands of words separated by innumerable colons, semicolons, and commas, and only a single lonely pair of full stops. The giddy virtuosity of the text provides a context for the images that streamed out of Paris after the negotiation, of world leaders and business tycoons embracing each other, of negotiators with tears in their eyes, of delegates crowding joyfully together to be photographed. The euphoria that resulted is as clearly evident in the text of the agreement as it is in the pictures. The virtuosity of its composition is a celebration of its own birth. There is no such exuberance in Laudato Si, which is remarkable instead for the sober clarity with which it addresses complex questions. While the preambles of the agreement occupy a prosodic domain of their own, somewhere between poetry and prose, Laudato Si resorts to poetry only at the very end, in 2 concluding prayers. Here again lies an unexpected difference between the documents. Because of the prayerful ending of Laudato Si, it might be thought that there would be more wishful thinking and conjecture in the encyclical than in the agreement. But that too is by no means the case. It is the Paris Agreement, rather, that repeatedly invokes the impossible. For example, the aspirational goal of limiting the rise in global mean temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade, a target that is widely believed to be already beyond reach. Although the Paris Agreement does not lay out the premises on which its targets are based, it is thought that they're founded on the belief that technological advances will soon make it possible to whisk greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and bury them deep underground. But these technologies are still in their nascency, and the most promising of them, known as biomass energy carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, would require the planting of bioenergy crops over an area larger than India. To invest so much trust in what is yet only a remote possibility is little less than an act of faith, not unlike religious belief. Laudato Si, by contrast, does not anywhere suggest that miraculous interventions may provide a solution for climate change. It strives instead to make sense of humanity's present predicament by mining the wisdom of a tradition that far predates the carbon economy. In the text, even less does the encyclical hesitate to criticize the prevalent paradigms of our era. Most of all, it is fiercely critical of the idea of infinite or unlimited growth, which proves so attractive to economists, financiers, and experts in technology. This is a quote. It returns to this theme repeatedly, insisting that it is because of the technocratic paradigm that we fail to see the deepest root of our present failures. In the text of the Paris Agreement, by contrast, there is not the slightest acknowledgement that something has gone wrong with our dominant paradigms. It contains no clause or article that could be interpreted as a critique of the practices that are known to have created the very situation the agreement seeks to address. The current paradigm of perpetual growth is enshrined at the core of the text. So really, the Paris Agreement is, if you read through it with any care, you see from top to bottom, it's imbued with what Akeel calls the superstitions of modernity. And these superstitions are maintained, again, as Akeel remarks, by sheer intellectual browbeating through the institutions that we come through from our childhood onwards. So maybe we can take that up from there. Thank you.
So let's begin there. I was struck in particular by a sentence that I think in some ways is at the very heart of what the book calls us to do. You write, when future generations look back upon the Great Derangement, they will certainly blame the leaders and politicians of this time for the failure to address the climate crisis, but they may well hold artists and writers to be equally culpable. And then this is the telling phrase for me, for the imagining of possibilities is not, after all, the job of politicians and bureaucrats. The imagining of possibilities is not, after all, the job of politicians and bureaucrats. Well, you can imagine that that's a haunting sentence, since theologians are also in the business of imagining possibilities unthought of in many ways. So this brings me around to the Laudatoc document. What is it in the imagination of that text, or its capacity for imagination, in your sense, that exceeds so thoroughly and so radically the failure of imagination that you see in the Paris Climate Accords? Why is one text able to do what it does, as you so compellingly demonstrate, and the other one fails so profoundly?
Well, as a writer, of course, my interest is in words and rhetoric, if you like. And I think, to me, what really captivated me about this text is, in the first instance, the nature of its rhetoric, in a precise sense. I mean, that is, the manner of its wording, the manner of its composition. Because the really remarkable thing about this document, the moment you read it, is that you can see that the Pope's effort is to make these issues clear to poor people, to ordinary people, and it makes sense. I mean, of course, for someone like him, for someone in his position, he has had first-hand experience of who the poor are, and what language they understand, and where they live, and what their concerns are. If you look at the text of the Paris Agreement, on the other hand, the most evident thing about it is that it's a document that's meant to be closed behind a wall of expertise. Everything about this document signals closure, withdrawal. It actually, one of the really remarkable parts of this document is that it calls for the creation of certain climate champions. Now, who are meant to be the climate champions? Obviously, it's meant to be some bureaucrat. This entire language, the entire language of the document, the way in which it chooses its words, just implies that, it's a sort of elite handover to people, who proclaim themselves climate champions, as it were, or climate experts. To me, that is what is really so interesting about this document, its effort to open itself, because it's rare, really, to come across a piece of writing which strives in this way to open itself.
Yeah, Amitav, it's I always used to think that the nuclear danger and its tremendous possibilities for derangement really came to the public mind because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there was a spectacular event which made it absolutely clear what this danger was. And the climate issue has been simmering and growing for a very long time. But it didn't have its Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And one of the really sort of brilliant things about this book is that you are very keen to point out that there are fantastic moments which get domesticated because people want it all to be, some part of what Kuhn would call normal science. They just make everything sober and systematic. Whereas there are non-gradualist, as I think in Gould's terms to put it, that there are remarkable moments which the public needs to the public attention needs to be brought, and I think your book does it in a way, and Pope Francis does it, and bringing this to public attention through the stressing of these remarkable moments rather than the gradualist understanding of how human history and climate has developed is really very crucial to your book, is it not?
Yes, absolutely. But, that's the extraordinary thing. These remarkable moments are happening all around us now. I mean, you really can't escape them. I mean, especially 2017. If I'd written my book in 2017, I would have put in some of these moments. Yeah. Think about it, Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston, one of the richest cities in the world, absolutely devastated it. Look at Puerto Rico today, 6 months after the hurricane, half the people still don't have electricity. The hospitals are operating out of tents. People don't have water. Puerto Rico is undergoing one of the biggest depopulation events in modern history. So if these things aren't recognized to be present, and at the same time you can see that within the whole world of the media, it's completely glossed over. Why? And I'll give you an example from last year which really made it clear to me. In Genoa, in Italy, there was suddenly one of those flash floods that happens so often now. And this flash flood came at night and swept through parts of this town. And in one very tragic case, there was an elderly man who had rented the bottom floor of his house to his daughter and son-in-law and their 2 children. And he suddenly woke up in the middle of the night, realized that there was this flood coming through, and he dived in and tried to save them. And he managed to bring out his daughter, one grandchild, but he and everyone else of the rest of his family died. And this was on the front pages of the Italian papers for 1 day, 2 days. They talked about it. 3rd day, it was gone. And if you think about it, a country like Italy, say 200-300 years ago, it would not have disappeared in that way. There would have been a mass, there would have been a continuous set of rituals going on, a year later, years later. There would have been a public attention, And really, in many senses, what is ritual but the enactment of possibility? Yeah. And that is what has absolutely disappeared. I think it's precisely because we do not know how to ritualize, how to mark these events that we can't even assimilate their extraordinariness.
Right, and it's related to the way you describe the difference between the Paris Agreement document and the Pope Francis text, isn't it? Because I think, in a way, to put the point you're making more generally, this is really the difference between seeing the world in a very detached way and engaging with it. It's not just climate, but even if you take something like killing, like violence, there was a time when if you had to kill somebody in battle, you had to go in front of them and take a spear and pierce them. You couldn't look into their eyes because they might have had a helmet on over them, but there was this engagement in killing. Now you go 5 miles up in the air and you bomb the hell out of a city, and it's a statistic in a newspaper which then disappears after a while. Who remembers what happened in Fallujah? Or it's all just a detached view of the world. And I think part of what you're saying about the urgencies that literature must return to is to bring back the sense of engagement from this complete disengagement and detachment of the modern period.
Absolutely. There's a very wonderful passage in your essay on Gandhi and Marx, where you say that in effect, our whole modern mindset is absolutely at the bottom founded on the idea that all that is bad in us can be reformed through politics or reformed through the state. And you say also that Gandhi never believed this because he was a religious person. And similarly, that has never been believed by say, Catholic theologians, One of the things that you really have to part company with when you look at this material carefully is, in a sense, a kind of liberal progressivism. Because it's so clear that, this idea that history has a trajectory, that it has a certain sort of progressive end point or whatever, or even a direction, becomes completely absurd when you look at climate change. And that's where, I suddenly recall, say, a figure like Carl Schmitt, who said, history is instead a labyrinth in which we blindly wander without knowing where is the beginning or the end. And of the two visions of what history is, it's so clear that in fact we are in the second rather than in the first. So, I think one of the real problems in terms of the whole literature on climate change, everything that is produced on climate change, is that so much of it comes out of universities, especially Western universities, because that is what imbues it really with this idea of technocratic solutions, because within these university communities, there's a complete agreement on this.
Right.
One of the things, since we're talking about history, that as a theologian I obsess about is this question about where the linearity of our imagination comes from, and to what extent perhaps religious traditions, particularly Christian ones, are responsible for it. And in sort of musing about this, as I want to, I turn biblical, and I try to think about the one time in the biblical passage that I can quickly recall where Jesus talked about the weather. And I don't know if you remember it, and it's a fascinating phrase because nature and history are juxtaposed, and this is a central concern of your book. So this is from Matthew. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to test Jesus. They asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." Then he left them and went away. It's a fascinating passage because Jesus seems to be inviting people to say, well, look, you know how to read the weather, but you don't know how to read history. The kairos is coming. A turning of events is coming. And it feels to me like not all Christian theology, but I think particularly certain modes of contemporary Protestant theology or modern Protestant theology really took this turn to history over nature to an extreme and perhaps misread Jesus on this point. He was actually suggesting somehow that nature is harder to read and yet you somehow manage, but history you can't. Now in your book, of course, you're saying nothing is possible to read, including the sort of dichotomy between nature and history itself, because the whole thing is upset by what some have called global weirding. Right? You don't use the phrase in the book, but I've often found it felicitous, not least for the ways in which the complete predictability of nature is no longer possible. And I wanted to sort of show you one particular moment in modern theology that I found deeply problematic, and perhaps is one of the sources of our problem. But it's Bultmann, famous Protestant theologian. He writes, "Our relationship to history is wholly different from our relationship to nature. Man, if he rightly understands himself," pardon the data-gendered language here, "man, if he rightly understands himself, differentiates himself from nature. When he observes nature, he perceives there something objective, which is not himself. When he turns his attention to history, however, he must admit himself to be a part of history, a living complex of events in which he is essentially involved. He cannot observe this complex objectively as he can observe natural phenomena. For in every word he says about history, he is saying at the same time something about himself." It's an odd passage. He's saying that the human being cannot, in fact, recognize himself in history, but only in some sense, in nature, but only in history. It's as though Bultmann took Jesus to an extreme, absurd point of reductio ad absurdum. And one of the things I see the whole book attempting to do is to rethink the very positioning of nature and history, or perhaps even nature and culture more generally. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that in light of these musings about temporality, trajectory, history, nature.
But John, I think one of Amitav's points in the book is that that distinction is not there, that in fact nature is really the sort of thing. There's a very nice passage where he talks about there is a sort of equation between what is without and what is within in the book. And so here is an example that brings out what Amitav is driving at here. So take a Bangladeshi fisherman who sees something on the horizon. And part of the modern worldview is that what he sees is to be described as a meteorological phenomenon, right? But the Bangladeshi fisherman sees it as a threat in the ordinary language of the Pope's text, not in the language of the Paris Accord. And threats are part of nature. That's part of his point, that nature has what. So nature threatens. It's an agentive term, right? It threatens the fisherman. Now, the modern way of thinking about this is that really nature doesn't consist of threats. It only consists of meteorological phenomena. And what really, the only thing that's enchanted, sometimes granted, is us. So there's a whole Vestalian tradition which says human beings are enchanted, but not the world, right? But that's what he's denying. So really the point is, so the modern view is human beings feel vulnerability, and they project it illicitly onto nature and call it a threat out there. But there's no threat, there are only condensations, etc. out there. So what he's saying is, I think what Amitav is driving at in this book is, no, there are, the vulnerability that a person feels within comes from seeing the threat without, and there's no difference. It's not as if seeing the perception of the threat out there in the horizon is something different from feeling the vulnerability within. These are not two things, but the same thing, right? And that's the sense in which there's agency both out there and here. And history is not unique. And this is true of nature too, that humanity is completely locked in a single equation. It's not a dichotomy, a sort of Cartesian or other kind of term.
Yeah, I mean, what you've shown very powerfully in your work is this whole Cartesian way of transforming all existence into cognition, into cogitation, which in fact is what Gandhi so powerfully denies. I mean, but this whole enchantment thing, you're right. I mean, in the modern worldview, we should be seeing, a tornado or something, thinking of it as a meteorological phenomenon. But the modern worldview is itself very conflicted. I was very powerfully reminded of this, when there were these eclipses last year. And I follow a lot of scientists, climate scientists, and they were all so excited, saying, look, people are excited about science, as if humanity had never known about eclipses before science. But they clearly weren't. They clearly weren't following what the Americans were doing. They were scheduling their weddings. They were driving behind the eclipse in a sort of crazy way. So obviously, this has much more to do with astrology and meanings than it does with, as it were, scientific rationality. But yet, the one enchants the other, in this particular instance. And you see this constantly within American life. I don't know if you've ever been to a place called the Four Corners, which is, it's actually very strange. It's in the middle of a Navajo area, which is completely sacralized for the Navajo, the mountains and the hills and so on. But the big place over there is called the Four Corners, where, 4 states intersect. And if you go there, you'll see people trying to balance on exactly that thing. I mean, standing on their head, standing on their toes. I mean, it's this strange enchantment of lines, of a kind of rationality. But, I completely agree with you. I think, this distinction between nature and so on and culture, which is really where your work so beautifully dovetails with Bruno Latour's, is that, these are completely absurd constructs. And really, these are constructs which really maybe only very highly educated people believe. Because most people in the world still haven't succumbed to this way of thinking about. But Akeel, let me push you a little over there, because in your work on enchantment, you're willing to do away with this distinction and so on, but you are not willing to do what Gandhi does, or what I would do, which is to allow intentionality or agency to the non-human. I mean, aren't you in your own way then capitulating to this particular strain of modernity?
Yeah, Amitav, that's one of the hardest questions. The thing is, so I'm not a vitalist about nature. Here's what I think, and I'd be very curious to know what somebody who's thought deeply about literature and language would make of it. See, so you have Bruno and you have people like Jane Bennett and so on who really are vitalists. I mean, they do think of nature as having intentional vitalism. And here's what I think. I think that we should use the vocabulary of intent. We cannot avoid using the vocabulary of intentional. I'm not talking about animals. Animals are, it's just but I'm talking now about things, including, say, trees or forests and so on. I think natural elements make normative demands on us. They are shot through with elements of value which make normative demands on us. Now, do they literally make normative demands on us in the way that, say, you might make a normative demand on me or I on you? That's what I don't think it's necessary to say, that it's literally true. But, so here's the crucial point. I think it is a metaphor to say that they make normative demands on us. But since almost every sensible person agrees that metaphors can't be paraphrased away into literal statements. I mean, that would, there would be no literature possible if that were true. So, since everybody, all philosophers of language, linguists agree that metaphors can't be paraphrased away to literal, that can't just be a thesis about language, metaphor. It must have a metaphysical counterpart. And that metaphysical counterpart is that if metaphors can't be translated away into literal sentences, then then you have to say that the counterpart to that is that there's some element or fragment of nature that can't be captured by anything but that metaphor. Right? So I can have it both ways. I can say that this is a metaphor, and I can say nothing else will capture that aspect of reality but that metaphor of it making normative demands on us. And so I don't say, so there are laws of conservation and all that vitalism may, so I don't want to say anything unscientific. I just want to be unscientistic without being unscientific.
Yeah. If I can respond to that, Akeel, that's a very beautifully put, I think, within the constraints of the tradition that you're working in, which is obviously that one in which every statement has to be true universally, that it has to apply in all times and all places, that the sorts of statements that you're making about metaphor or whatever. But let me put it to you like this: what if we take a different view and say that it's not always the same? What if we say that it's not all human beings who can necessarily understand the voices of nature. And the moment you see that, the moment you say that, you realize that in every culture, in all places and all times, there have been people who've been able to give voice to nature, who've literally, and not just to animals. You know, we know from Eduardo Cohn's work and from the work of many others, including, I don't know if you've read this wonderful book about, actually voiced by the Yanomami shaman, where there are certain people who are specialists, who specialize in that in the same way that you specialize in philosophy, who very rigorously can voice certain things. Just as we know there are horse whisperers, there are people who have a closer understanding of, let's say, dogs than you and I do. So, the moment we accept that just because I can't understand what nature is saying, that it's not necessarily the case that nobody can. We know historically, we know in all human societies there have been specialists who can understand these things. And I think if one does not allow for that, then really one is again trapped in the world of this all knowledge being cognition. Simply in the sense that what we are saying is that what we see and what we feel and what we touch is all there is. And I think in our hearts we know that is not the case. There is more. It's just that can you tune into it or not?
Yeah, so I certainly agree. I mean, I'm wondering where, if any, there's any disagreement here. I certainly agree that in many cultures today, and certainly many cultures of the past, people have simply taken it for granted that nature is sacralized, either in some pagan form or even in popular Christianity. I mean, Bruno and Ficino and people like that took it for, and a whole range of people in 17th century Europe. Winstanley is somebody whom I write about. So there's a whole range of historical figures and contemporary indigenous cultures in which nature is taken to speak to us. But my point is that were we even to say that we cannot, given the fact that we've been brought up differently in a quite different zeitgeist, we can't actually see it that way, there is absolutely no reason to buy into what I call the superstition of modernity, because we can still, even in our thoroughly modern framework, we can still see nature as shot through with value, even if the source of value is not sacralized. Right? We can see it shot through with value, and science doesn't study value. Right? So there's something there's more to nature, even for me, and brought up in so the equation of nature with what the natural science studies can be denied, even if. And so when I say it makes normative demands or value demands on us, I'm speaking in my voice, and I'm saying, do I see it as literally doing so because there's some vitalist or sacral voice there? I don't. But that doesn't in the slightest force me into any scientific picture, because the metaphor is, there's no other way to capture that reality except through that metaphor, even if for a lot of cultures it's not a metaphor and it's literal.
So in effect you're saying that what we need is a metaphysic that makes possible certain kinds of dispositional attitudes, like responsivity, mutuality. That,
which is what he's trying to capture,
yes,
with the within and without thing that he
that's right.
Yeah.
So it's not necessary, in your account, for any kind of ontological vitalism. You just need some kind of axiological affirmation that there is value to which we are obliged to be responsive, into which dispositions of mutuality can enter.
Right, whereas Latour and all say it is agentive, and I'm saying I can't get myself. So I'm completely with Amitav. Different cultures have done it differently. But all I'm saying is, even within my thoroughly modern culture, I don't have to accept any science.
But Akeel, even within your culture, I'm very struck that in this essay on enchantment, you don't refer to Whitehead, because that there is even within your specific culture.
Yeah, I should really invoke Whitehead more than I do, and Whitehead is a thoroughly modern figure, as you say, and it quite right. Yeah, I should really think more about Whitehead. I find him very hard to read.
Almost as hard as those literary figures that you spoke of.
That's true of
Yes, it's true of Hegel and Marx. So.
Well, if you can make it through Hegel and Marx, you can make it through Whitehead. But
Yes, right.
the interesting thing about that omission is that you work and see yourself as part of a romantic tradition.
Yeah.
And arguably there is no philosopher more attentive to the romantic trajectory, particularly romantic poets, with whom he begins, of all things, Science in the Modern World.
Yeah.
So it's quite very much a part of this trajectory and community of inquiry that you do your work with.
Yeah. Actually, there's a wonderful few pages in the book where Amitav talks about a great climactic event, and then juxtaposes it with when Byron and Shelley meet in somewhere near Mont Blanc, is it?
Yes.
Say a little bit more about that.
Oh, it's just, in 1815, there was a big volcano went off in Sumatra, resulted in this great global cooling event. And it so happened that Byron, Shelley, and Mary Shelley ended up in Geneva in a little hotel. And one day they were all feeling so haunted by the strange weather that Byron said to the others, "We all have to write ghost stories." And that night was a moment when science fiction was invented, because Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein. Byron wrote a vampire story. So there you are, Akeel. I mean, those are the ways in which the earth itself does intervene. And it's so interesting that the 17th century is when all this stuff is happening, with Descartes and so on. And that again works under a climatic anomaly. It's the Little Ice Age. And it's almost as though the planet were really playing with us, So I think if you look at these events as they unspool, you can often see something which, again, could be read metaphorically as a literal intervention of the planet,
And that's important to you. That, I mean, it certainly is almost of a kind of soteriological importance in Latour, right? It is the speaking back of the planet that has any hope of preventing the situation that we are in. We might actually listen to Gaia. Why does it matter to you? And also say a bit more about, is that why Whitehead also matters to you?
Look, I think at bottom it must come from the fact that, I was brought up as a Hindu, brought up very much with a kind of Hindu mythology, and these are the texts I often find myself returning to now. And in these texts, the omnipresence of, the agentative creature, the agentative being, it's everywhere. If you look at the first part of the Mahabharata, the Adiparv, it's all about snakes. And the ways in which the snakes are, and throughout the Mahabharata, the snakes constantly intervene. It's so striking. Snakes intervene, flowers intervene, plants intervene. And then you have these other beings, this whole range of beings, demonic beings, other beings of various kinds. And even if you look at so many of the gods and goddesses of the Hindu tradition within the actual sort of Purans that present them, they're often nothing than translators. They're translating a particular class of animal for people. The the best example that I can think of is of Manusha Devi, the goddess of snakes. I mean, it's not like she's the goddess in the sense that she tells the snakes what to do and they do it. On the contrary, they defy her constantly. She is actually a powerless person, just trying to translate for them, So, within that tradition, I think this is very important, but it's not just within the Hindu tradition, because again, the 17th century, one of the most interesting ways in which we see this manifest itself in Europe is, on the one hand, the nature culture thing arises out of, Descartes and so on, but on the other hand, it also arises out of the Inquisition. Because that's what the Inquisitor is doing. He's trying to decide what is natural, what is supernatural. And it's so interesting. I mean, I've just been reading this book on the Inquisition in Venice, and it was a very different form of Inquisition because these were all rationalists trained, in Padua, where Galileo had a huge influence and so on. And they're listening to these arguments very, very carefully, about if is so-and-so an enchanter or an enchantress, are they possessed by demons and so on. And, you are so careful in your work to say that you don't want to have any truck with supernaturalism. But they had another category. There's the natural, the supernatural, and the preternatural, on which they would not pronounce. And I think that is really what we have to remind ourselves of, that, there is this other thing. But there again, I want to say that, I think one of the reasons why the Pope and, so many others within the tradition have been able to come to grips with what is happening in the world around us is precisely because they have a sense of the evil that exists within human beings. Yeah. It doesn't arise out of a sense of a kind of liberal, how shall we say, what you've described so well in your book. And what is figured as evil in the Christian context becomes figured in, say, the Hindu or the Buddhist context as demonic. And really, if you look at what is happening in the world right now, just to look at it as a metaphor, in a way, the Hindu sort of myths of the end of the world are exactly this. Human beings become demons driven by greed. Yeah. And they are not able to stop themselves.
Right. You see, the thing is that I think the point in history that you're focusing on in your trying to figure out the origins of the mentality behind the Anthropocene, the thinking, and not just the material development through industrialization and so on, but the thinking that underlay it. The thinking that underlay it defined nature for the first time, and this happened in the 17th century. It equated nature with that which the natural sciences study, right? That's the definition of nature that made all the difference, right? That nature equals what the natural sciences study. And in that sense, I too am a supernaturalist, because I think nature contains value properties which the natural sciences don't study. So I don't disavow supernaturalism, even if I am not a religious person in that. Yeah, right.
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is, and I mentioned this to you in our last conversation, there's a process philosopher working in the Whiteheadian tradition who speaks about re-enchantment without supernaturalism.
Who does?
David Ray Griffin. He's got a lovely book by the title Re-enchantment Without Supernaturalism.
M.H. Abrams has a fantastic book. Everybody should read it, called Natural Supernaturalism. It's one of the truly great books of literary criticism. In fact, I was teaching a graduate course on Romanticism. There were 40 students in it. Not one of them had read it. They'd all read the latest stuff from Paris, but they had not one of them had read this book or Bloom or any of the Romanticist theories. It's shocking. It's a great book, and it's just what you're describing. Natural supernaturalism, he calls it. Yeah.
So there are multiple ways of getting to some account of nature that is non-reductive and is able to speak in some fundamental way about value as present in nature, not merely superimposed upon it by us. And I think on that point we're all
Yes,
three
we're
of
all in
us
complete agreement.
in agreement, right? The Gandhi has come up, and he figures interestingly in your book. And I wonder if we can spend some time on that, because you note, of course, that he does succeed as a nationalist liberator of India, but that he completely fails in what was central to his own self-understanding, and in fact more primary than the project of independence, and that was arresting the rapaciousness of modernity, the unchecked rapaciousness of modernity, which he said, if were, as you note in your book, if it were imitated by then the 300 millions of India, the entire planet would be devoured like locusts. Right? So it's a profound moment in his corpus, and of course that was one of the failures that I think he began to see towards the end, that this was hopeless. So how do we think about that failure? We can talk about the classical terms of ahankara, or egoism and craving and so forth. And certainly what the book is attempting to do is to say that we have to figure out a logic of desire that somehow arrests a kind of unchecked desire, which finds its most pernicious expression in an economy of unchecked and unlimited growth. Right? So that's, and clearly that was what Gandhi was trying to arrest. But you also in this book are deeply skeptical of moralisms that try to say that, each of us somehow, if we pull ourselves by our moral bootstraps, will somehow affect climate change. You don't believe that, and you think it's actually a pernicious notion. So, but of course you note this kind of discourse was central to Gandhi. So what are we to do about the question of Gandhi and desire in this particular situation with respect to climate change?
Well, long before Gandhi, the Buddha understood perfectly well that it was desire that would destroy both individual human beings and the world itself. So it's not like we didn't know, I mean, this is something we've always known. But, one thinker who to me has become very interesting and important is René Girard. I don't know if you know his work, but really, especially in relation to climate change, that aspect of it which we never deal with are these other really powerful elements of what it means to be human, which is mimesis, resentment, envy. And, if you're in India today and you talk to a middle-class Indian about climate change and so on, the first thing they'll say is, well, they got rich, they have 2 cars and a house, and now it's our turn, we want to be rich like them. It's completely mimetic, It's exactly what Gandhi pitched his whole life to oppose.
Amitav, when there was all this stuff in Singhur, remember, in Bengal,
yes.
And there was widespread protest among some people. Yes. Amartya Sen,
I saw
forget
that.
the middle class people, Amartya Sen said against the protests, England went through its pain to create its Londons and Manchesters, India will have to do so too. Now, if one of the most humane economists in the world says that, it's completely lost. I mean, it's just part of the intelligentsia's, way of thinking all over India, everywhere. Somebody like Chidambaram, who, took it to some incredible extremes, but if Sen says it, it's just everywhere in how people think.
But, economics is the discipline that's led us here. So what can we expect? I mean, you look at all sensible economists like Paul Krugman. I mean, again, what are they trying to do? They're trying to create what they call green growth, which is a complete chimera. There can be no such thing.
But it's part of what John was saying about history, and you talk about it too, which is this idea that this is mimesis, right? If it happened in England and creates its Londons and Manchesters, it must happen in its erstwhile colonies, right? I mean, this is just that view of history that you were talking about. And it's what Gandhi was saying, it doesn't have to happen. And by the way, Marx, who very often sounds as if he's very much part of this way of thinking, in the last 10 or 12 years of his life, when he was working with those Russian ethnological notebooks of his, said there's no reason why Russia has to go through the whole incubation of European capitalism. It could be, and he talks about India and Russia as not, so we usually read the Marx of Capital. We never read the early Marx, and we don't read this very late Marx, which is very similar to what Gandhi was saying about India.
But on that question, I mean, how do we thread the needle between the way in which the minute you start talking about mimesis and desire, you pointed out the rhetoric of how many light bulbs does Al Gore's house have, this sense of like, you can't speak about climate change unless you have impeccable climate change credentials in whether all your light bulbs are green or not. I mean, so on the one hand, you do have to speak about questions of desire, and desire, of course, has both a collective and an individual dimension. So, I mean, you want us to talk about it, and yet you're also profoundly afraid of the ways in which, in a moment that can't even think the collective, that's the central thesis of your book, any discourse about desire quickly becomes individualized and moralized in a reductive and unhelpful way. So I'm wondering what your thinking is around these issues.
The issues like desire, basically we can't talk about them. Simply because, in a way, economics has made it impossible to talk about these things, which is a strange thing, because Adam Smith, for example, understood perfectly well what wealth was. And wealth, he said, is what the other beholds. So wealth is essentially assimilable to envy. But you look at the way that the substantialist way in which economists today define wealth, which is that, minimum earning, or what they call absolute poverty or absolute whatever. And so if you adopt these ideas of absolute poverty, essentially all human beings who've lived before the 20th century were poor, more or less, you could say. Certainly, say Australian Aboriginals were poor, yet we know that Marshall Sahlins regarded them as the first affluent society. So, the Western world has now, for the last 50 years, been telling us that the rest of the world is backward, underdeveloped, that they're lacking in something. And you know what? Someone like Gandhi could say, no, we are not lacking in something. But that moment is gone. The whole world believes this now. The whole world believes that you're lacking in something. And it's not just in the West, in underdeveloped countries. I think most people, even within the West, think that they're lacking in something every time they look at a billionaire. So we are locked into this cycle, and it's a cycle which, is a cycle of such hopelessness.
Yeah, can I ask you a question, Amitav, about this? If it's true that the intelligentsia everywhere, in the West and in the emerging countries and perhaps every corner of the world, with minor exceptions, if everybody, in some sense, even those, you see, this, what I find really chilling is that even those who accept there's a serious problem of climate change, almost all of them refuse to accept that it comes from basically what you call some combination of capitalism and imperialism, right? That dialectical combination between the two, right? So you have, in fact, the leader of the Morales was in Copenhagen for the meeting, he walked out of Copenhagen. He said, "You guys haven't mentioned capitalism and imperialism. I'm not sticking around with this." He walked out. And so here's a question that I have. If everybody, even those who accept that there's a serious problem, don't accept what it implies, that you probably, as you yourself imply in one or two places, there is no way to deal sufficiently. You can tinker around, but there's no way to deal sufficiently with the climate change problem without putting such constraints on capital and its imperial flows, the capital flight, etc., that it may even be, in some sense, the terminus of capitalism as we know it. All right. So let's take the people who say there's a problem, but they don't accept this. Now, I ask you, if P implies Q, where P is there's a climate change problem, and Q is if there must be some serious reversal of capitalism, perhaps even ending it. If P implies Q, the climate change denier denies P. The climate change asserter, somebody who accepts it, accepts P, but doesn't accept P than Q. So why is one more rational than the other? It's just everybody is irrational on this.
Okay, the one thing that, I'm completely in agreement with you, but the one thing that I would add to that is that actually, I think it's a mistake to see capitalism as the core of this issue. I mean, Jameson famously said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. But I think that's not true. I think it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of empire. Because really, what is happening right now is that climate change is playing out literally as war. And I'll just give you one example of that, in 1 year of operations in the Middle East, the Pentagon puts out more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire nation of Bangladesh. 180 million people. The Pentagon is today the single largest user of fossil fuels in the world. And the Pentagon may be leading right now, but China and Russia are doing their best to catch up. So if you look at any graph of defense expenditure around the world, the only thing that is rising as steeply as emissions is defense expenditure.
I completely agree with that. I mean, the only qualification I would put is that I don't think you can understand capitalism without understanding that imperialism is the essence of capitalism.
Yeah,
that is, it's the drive of the constant dynamic drive of capital, seeking new markets, but seeking new sources of raw material and so on. So I don't distinguish between the two that much, but I agree with you. Given Western Marxists, Western people who have criticized capitalism don't quite see it. It's only we who've...
I'm going to add a few conversation partners to the conversation. And Catherine Keller, I've asked her to say a few words. She is a theologian who, among other things, is a Whitehead expert. So that isn't the only reason she's asking a question, but it might be one of her many concerns. Yep.
Well, I wasn't at all prepared for this outbreak of Whiteheadianism, so for me that's just a big temptation. So I'm saying, Whitehead, get thee behind me right now. But he might sneak in just a bit. But I thought it would be important, Amitav Ghosh, to just pull out a very crucial statement at the end of your book within this religious context where we all understand our religiosity in such varying ways that many of us would dispute that the word religion is adequate to it. But I think that given the worsening of the factors that motivated your book, the date of publication actually spared you from having to quickly write in the really scary acceleration that we're now going through, both in terms of state power and its fascist propensities to the degree that we can identify that with empire, I'm not sure. And then, of course, the crudest kind of capitalist anti-environmentalism underway. That's all causing a kind of deficit in hope among most of the people I think most of us talk to. So for me, it was very important after reading your wonderful literary analysis of Laudato Si in relation to the climate accord to come to this statement. But the most promising development, in my view, is the increasing involvement of religious groups and leaders in the politics of climate change. Pope Francis is, of course, the most prominent example, but some Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, and other groups and organizations have also recently voiced their concerns. And I want everyone here to just be taking that in. I didn't read you as anything but a very secular writer. And so when you became enchanted by the encyclical and then make this very political point about the coalitional importance of religions, I was very much taken off guard, and I think your readers will be too, because it's crucial for communities like this to recognize that we have a particular role to play with our varieties of secular religious, for me that's one word now, of secular religious thought and activism. Just a little footnote, I think it might be interesting to you that it was a bunch of Whiteheadian theologians who put together the first and a very fast reaction book. It came out within 2 months of the encyclical to greet Francis in his visit to the United States that September, but they were mostly Protestant process theologians who gathered together the 60 essays so quickly to try to mobilize not just an ecumenical force, but one including also many non-religious and certainly non-Christian thinkers within it. But here's where I'd like your help. With us who are working within this bridging of the secular religious and trying to mobilize here, especially church communities, for progressive activism, and we're thinking tonight particularly about climate change activism. I mean, I think we, and maybe this is the fact that a lot of us, most of us here are Protestant, I think we are still caught in some of the dilemmas that you point to as a Protestant legacy that has put nature in the background. And though we're good progressives, so we're sort of by definition ecologically in dispute any rapacious notion of man's dominion, nonetheless we seem to be reiterating those patterns. And the way it becomes insidious isn't in positions about climate change, it's in the difficulty we have of creating adequate coalitions. And that's where I think we find ourselves breaking into the different identitarianisms. And you talk about that as a problem in India, that there gets to be among progressive movements, among revolutionary movements even, there's such a strong focus on religious identity, gender issues come into play, that it's hard to then create the needed force field, if I'm understanding you right, that will pull our activism together. Well, I see that very much within Protestant progressive circles and leadership. Not that identity politics is the problem. I mean, that's just a way of saying that too often is just another way of trying to repress issues that are mind-bogglingly important, like Black Lives Matter, like Me Too, the multiplicity of race and sex and gender issues. that are usually very anthropocentrically conceived, but important. So the question is, how do we overcome the sort of moralistic, individualizing Protestantism that I think too easily breaks us into these identity groupings in a way that makes sense at first, politically, for galvanizing around an issue, but then can sabotage the kind of intersectionality and just simply the fast enough and adequate enough coalitions that will always then embed themselves in the liveliness of the earth if we're to have any hope at all right now. So I think you have some clues for us.
I should note quickly that we have on stage a Hindu, a Christian, and a Muslim. So at least in this particular constellation of Indians, we're beyond identity politics on this question.
I think Akeel, I would point out, as Akeel does, that it's very rare for me to identify as.
Yes.
I'm just saying that, it's a cultural context rather than anything else. But, thank you very much for that question. At the end of my book, when I talk about, finding some hope in religious traditions and so on, it was really mainly, let me say, a reference to Pope Francis. Because he actually is completely sui generis. I mean, the reality is that within Hindu groups, within Buddhism even, and certainly also within Islam, what we now have as the dominant traditions are very much Protestantized versions of basically religion as capitalism kind of idea. I mean, within Hinduism today in India, the major figures are all these gurus who sell lots of stuff and become billionaires, and similarly, if you look at Erdogan's Turkey, it's very much an accelerationist version of Islam. It's even true of, say, Buddhism in Thailand today. So, yes, I mean, it's true that I do think that Pope Francis has really brought this attention to, simply because he can reach 1 billion people. He has brought this message into the homes and hearts of a lot of people around the planet in a way that nobody else could have, I think. But, I was looking for, as it were, a slender thread of hope in all this. But beyond that, I really don't know whether, if you look at the way that religions are going across the world, it's very hard to see that many of them will be able to really confront these issues. In that way, really, because I suppose I know India and what's happening within the sort of circles there, it's increasingly you see a kind of rationalized Hinduism, which is sort of, even that sense of a sort of response to, let's say, that animist aspect of our mythology, even that is disappearing. People just...
we want to be sure a union student gets in the mix. So Christopher Fici will ask a question. Christopher is working on eco-theology as one of as a central focus of his PhD work here.
Thank you, all three of you, and Dr. Ghosh, for your wonderful book. These conversations where we get into the substance of derangement are so important because there are so many of us who are not considering consciously that substance. My mind always turns to the question of then, in a parallel line to considering the substance of derangement, what do we do to respond to it, to confront it, perhaps even to cure it, to dare to think that we can possibly cure this in some way. And one way that I think about this in my own work is this kind of concept of anticipation, of looking at this moment that we're in and very consciously anticipating a way into what is not just, as you talk about in your book, not just climate change, but a catastrophe, a crisis, a climate crisis. And Larry Rasmussen, who is a longtime professor here, talks about creating these kinds of anticipatory communities. And people have been doing this This is not a new thing in any sense. The urgency of it, creating these kinds of communities, is especially acute now. So my kind of constructive question that I think for all of us, as I think we're all charged and called to develop this consciousness of anticipation, to come out of this conversation and go back into our communities, turn those communities into anticipatory communities. And you speak about this too in terms of what can we take, what are some of the more constructive tools that we can take from your book, from your own thinking, from your writing? As you say, one of the ways that our imagination is so limited is because we've lost that sense of collective thinking. So I'm just curious to kind of hear from you some particular tools that we could think about and some practices, some methods to expand our sense of imagination so that we can be more anticipatory and we can turn our communities into anticipatory communities.
That's a very good question, and of course, in relation to climate, the issues of activism always comes up. What can we do? How can we do it? I think if I were 20 or 30 years younger, I would be thinking about those things as well, but I'm not. And I really don't know how to activate communities and so on. Now, sometimes in the past I've tried to be an activist and I've always been terrible at it. So, it takes a special kind of imagination to do that. At this point, I think the only thing I can do is really to try and, I wrote this book as a work of introspection, really, trying to understand what it is in my own mind that has been unable to, as it were, grapple with the reality that is unfolding around us, and trying to change my work in ways that might make it easier. But this idea of communities, again, there is a really important imaginative dimension there. That, people can't, if you look at the Paris Agreement, for example, never once does it use the word catastrophe. And that's what we see unfolding around us. And in the encyclical, we see this. So this is what has happened through this tradition of gradualism, through a certain kind of liberal rosiness, that the very idea of catastrophe has vanished from the culture. So even just to let people understand what catastrophe really is, and these catastrophes are unfolding around us every day now, People are being hit by them all the time.
We're mindful that many of you will want to get a copy of Akeel's book, so rather than... sorry. I meant to say Amitav's book. I don't think Akeel's book is here.
It's too expensive.
Well, it's not this big, so it's worth the price when you do get it. So for that reason, we're not going to open it up to questions, but I suspect many of you will want to say hi to Amitav as you get your book signed. So let's call the evening to conclusion. I do want to announce the next event in the Insight Project, and that's a conversation with Brian Greene on April 10th. So if you want to RSVP for the Greene event, on the weirdness of physics and the conversation to be led by Bob Wright, please do, and you can visit utsnyc.edu/insight to RSVP for that event. So the last task for us is, of course, to thank Amitav and Akeel for an utterly stimulating conversation that I suspect will leave us with many more questions to think and ponder for quite a long time. So thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Akeel. Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. I just hope those horrible Hindu fundamentalists don't get on my case now.